toleration than most places in Europe, and it became a very thriving commercial center. And both Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews and other people resorted to Amsterdam. Now, I'll give some of the first, as I put this in quotation marks, some of the first Jews who have become British North America. Some of these are disputed. One of them is Johann Gans, the first Jew in British North America, who was a Bohemian mining expert and metallurgist. Sir Walter Raleigh, a name you're probably familiar with, recruited Gans for his expedition to Roanoke Island in the Virginia colony. Fortunately for Gans, he went back to England with Sir Francis Drake in 1586 because in the next year, the Roanoke colony mysteriously disappeared, and it hasn't been found since. The only real clue was that when people came from English people came back a few years later looking for them, the island was deserted, the colony was deserted, except this one word, Croatan, had been carved on a tree. And they still are trying to figure out what that's about. If you go down there today, they actually put on a dramatic play about the lost colony in Roanoke. Another one that I'll put in quotation marks with a question mark is Elias Lagarde in 1621. He may have been a Sephardic Jew from Languedoc in France who was recruited to come to Virginia, to Jamestown, Virginia, as an indentured servant of Anthony Banal. An indentured servant is just someone working under a time contract. They usually make a deal for the expense of the trip for having clothes and food and shelter when they get here. They usually have to say they'll agree to work for somebody for a certain amount of time, usually 7 years. After that, they're free people. The big difference between indentured servitude and the African slavery. Can I hit a button? I hate when I hit a button. Go away button, whatever you're doing. Let's see if I can get that to go away. Hooray. Okay. Chubby fat fingers. But anyway, but after his indenture was up, he did acquire land. People have argued whether he was really Jewish or not, or just from Languedoc. I don't know. I never met him, so I put it out there for that. These are two other people that were probably Jewish, Solomon Franco and Solomon Pearson. In 1649, Franco, who was an agent for a Dutch merchant in New Amsterdam, which of course was what New York used to be called when it was a Dutch colony, he went up to Boston to sell supplies to the Puritans there, but the Puritans refused to pay, and they decided to expel him. They didn't expel his goods, they just expelled him and didn't pay him. Later, he converted to Anglicanism, so we don't know if we want to count him or not. Started Jewish. 1654, Pearson settled in New Amsterdam, and in 1656, he converted and married a Christian woman. There are other possible Jews before the 1700s when a lot more Jewish settlers came over, including Moses Simonson, who came to Plymouth Colony on the Fortune in 1621. The next ship after the Mayflower doesn't get as much press. But anyway, he eventually married a Christian woman, settled in Duxbury, and seems to have blended into the Puritan majority. The real story of, instead of this person here, that person there, but the Jewish community in the New World, I think has to start with Dutch Brazil, New Holland, which was a colony from 1630 to 1654 on the tip, the most easternmost tip of South America. You can see a little map of it here. And by January 1654, the Portuguese had basically pushed the Dutch out of New Holland, and the last refuge was the city of Recife. That when the Portuguese took that, that ended the Dutch colony in South America. You can say, oh well, that's too bad, no Dutch colony, but you got to remember the Portuguese were part of that Inquisition, that effort by the Iberian rulers of Spain and Portugal who have one religion for one country, and that religion was not Judaism, so or Islam for that matter. You had a lot of people with forced conversions, they call them in Spanish and Portuguese conversos, who probably didn't wholeheartedly embrace their enforced new faith. But anyway, the point is that several ships of Jewish settlers fled Recife as the Portuguese took it and tried to get back to Holland. And one of these groups was 23 Sephardic refugees, 4 couples, 2 widows, and 13 children. It sounds like, kind of like the beginning of a joke, but anyway, I'm not going to go there. But they were on the ship Flock, which I don't think is that euphonic a name, but that's just my ear. Anyway, the next character in this drama, Jacob Bar Simpson, it's exactly what he was doing there is a little open to debate. There's different stories that have survived. He was an Ashkenazi merchant, and he was an agent of the Dutch West India Company. Of course, the West Indies refer to what we now think of as the Caribbean Basin. Some claim that he was one of those refugees from Recife. Others that he was actually sent by Jews in Amsterdam to New Amsterdam, New York City, to inquire about possible Jewish settlement in the New World, in New Amsterdam. It's unclear what his real background was, except that he did end up in New Amsterdam. And we'll come back to him in a minute. Levi von Swellen was a kosher butcher, and his background is also disputed, except that by 1654, he was in New Amsterdam, and he really tried to stand up for his rights as a citizen of that colony. And he was the first Jew to own land in America, and several New York City parks have been named after him. A public bathhouse, that's this neoclassical building on the bottom there, and a public school, PS 19, is named after von Swellen. Anyway, back to the Flock and those 23 Sephardic refugees. They were blown off course on their way back to Holland, and they were captured by Spanish pirates. These aren't really the pirates this I thought was just a really great slide of pirates from about that time. But they look terrifying. I wouldn't want to be captured by them. Anyway, they were taken to Cuba, and there they were able to get passage on the St. Catharina for New Amsterdam. Not Old Amsterdam where they wanted to go, but at least they were getting out of Cuba. And like the Portuguese taking over the Dutch colony of Recife, Cuba, of course, was a Spanish colony. They had their own Inquisition to worry about. So regardless, neither place was safe for Jews, so they were heading for New Amsterdam, where they arrived in September of 1654. Some people have retroactively called the St. Catharina the Jewish Mayflower because it did bring the first community of Jewish settlers to the New World, as opposed to just the odd laborer or merchant on his own. But as often happened, of course, you have disputes with the anti-Semitic leadership of New Amsterdam. But with help from Van Swellen and Bar Simpson, the matter of whether these refugees could stay in New Amsterdam or not, it was resolved, and the Dutch West India Company, which basically saw profit as their primary motive, and thus anything that smacked of discrimination would be a deterrent to profitability. So I don't know if it was, I think that was their motivation. I don't think it was because, they were great friends to the Jewish people. I think it was just a matter of some of the members and investors in this company were Jewish merchants. And anyway, Governor Peter Stuyvesant tried to expel them, and in 1655, they were allowed to travel, live, and trade in New Amsterdam, but were not granted full citizenship. In 1664, England defeated the Netherlands in a war, and one of the prizes of the war that England got was the settlement in New Amsterdam. When England, which remember had expelled the Jews from England in 1290 of the Common Era, so when England acquired New Amsterdam in 1664, a lot of the Jews there decided to leave. Some remained, however, including Asser Levy, and by 1695, Rabbi Saul Pardo Brown led a congregation of 20 Sephardic families in Manhattan. They worshiped in a little synagogue on Beaver Street, and there we had a small congregation by the early 1700s. This is not the early temple. This is a late 19th century temple where that congregation still worships on 70th Street in Manhattan. The congregation Sheriff Israel established in 1729. Again, some point to that earlier congregation and will claim the 1687 date for the establishment of the congregation. But here are some different representations of their various synagogues through history, from the early one on Mill Street in 1730 up to its enlargements, and then down to the more recent 1860 one before the one in the previous slide, which I can quickly go back to if you want to see it again. So anyway, basically bigger and better synagogues were being built as the congregation grew. But the community of Jews in New York did grow slowly, and immigrants in those early years were primarily Sephardic Jews from Spain, Portugal, and by way of Jews that ended up in the West Indies. The New York Colonial Legislature passed several acts that allowed the naturalization of Jewish immigrants. And by 1740, Parliament in England passed the Plantation Act, allowing Jews to be naturalized throughout the British colonies. Seeing from what I can see, it's mostly the economic advantage of that policy. During the French and Indian War, what in Europe, of course, was called the 7 Years' War, but here in the New World, it was usually called the 7 Years of the French and Indian War. Jacob Franks, a New York merchant, who had family connections in London, ended up becoming the royal agent for provisioning the British forces in America. In other words, the Halliburton of his day. And his dealings with the British Crown exceeded 750,000 pounds, which it was a vast amount of money back then. And of course, during the American Revolution, from 1776 until the very end of the Revolution in 1783, the British Army and Navy occupied New York City. Here's Mrs. Jacob Franks Abigail Levy, the daughter of Moses Raphael Levy, who ended up in New York by way of London, and originally an Ashkenazi Jew from Germany. Of course, as we were saying earlier in the night, the Truro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, is the oldest surviving synagogue in what's now the United States. That congregation was established back in the early 17th century in 1639, and the Newport colony in Rhode Island, the city of Newport, was founded by Roger Williams, who of course was expelled from Massachusetts, and because of theological differences with the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and so he instituted a policy of religious toleration in Rhode Island, and that included toleration towards Jews. And so a lot of Jews from Recife eventually settled in Newport as a result. And Mordecai Campanale and Moses Israel Pacheco purchased land for the first Jewish cemetery in America by 1677, and by 1695, the congregation Yeshua Israel was founded. The community grew in Newport as Newport itself grew in the 1700s, and many of those people came from by way of the Caribbean, having done business there for sometimes several years, for sometimes a couple generations. But the congregation Yeshua Israel built a synagogue in 1759 to 63, which, as I said, is the oldest one. They later named it for Isaac Truro. We'll get to him in a minute. During the American Revolution, of course, the British, with the largest navy in the world, had the ability to land troops just about anywhere they wanted, including Rhode Island. And so many of the Jewish merchants in Newport thought it would be much safer to get out of Newport for the duration of the war and move inland where the Royal Navy didn't have as long an arm for reaching. I mean, it's not a shock to anyone that when a war is going on, cities are targets, and very often Jews are targets. So some of those merchants in Newport decided to seek safety inland, and two of the leaders of that group in 1777, merchants and slave traders, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera and his son-in-law, Aaron Lopez, and their families, including 12 enslaved servants, 12 enslaved African-American servants, about 70 people in all, settled in a little town just bordering the town of Worcester, Massachusetts, on the west, the town of Leicester, Massachusetts, which is about 50 miles from Boston. British loyalists remained behind in Newport, including Cantor Isaac Turo, who safeguarded the synagogue, which was used for a time as a British hospital. When the British had evacuated Newport and the Lopez and Rivera families went back to Newport, Aaron Lopez on the road back fell out of his shay, a little two-wheeled wagon, and drowned in the swamp, unfortunately. So not all these stories are happy ones. But anyway, the Lopez home became a private high school called the Leicester Academy in 1784. This image I have here is kind of an early picture of it, sort of superimposed on what's there now, which is the campus of the former Becker College, which the town of Leicester purchased about 4 years ago when the college went out of business. But they don't have that home there anymore. This is a stylized, sort of photoshopped version. But anyway, Isaac Turo, who originally seemed to have come to Newport as a cantor and seems to have become a rabbi, from all I could find out, was born in Amsterdam, moved to Jamaica in 1758, and then relocated to Newport as a cantor in 1760. As I said, he was a loyalist. He was not a patriot. He thought that the Americas would be better off still as part of the British Empire, and so he remained in Newport when the British occupied the city. And in 1779, when the Americans reoccupied the city, he decided it wasn't safe to stay there anymore. So he got out of Newport and ended up in New York City with relatives. And by 1782, the American Revolution is pretty much wound down, but it's not officially over yet. And so, but he was not able to support himself, so he took a job in Kingston, Jamaica as a cantor, but soon thereafter he passed away. Skipping ahead to just after the American Revolution and our current constitutional republic, our first president, George Washington, visited Newport in 1790. George Washington, when he was the new president, realized that the new country needed to have something to focus on. And there was no internet, of course, no television, no radio. But he was a well-known symbol. He was probably one of the most well-known people in the world in 1790 because of his role leading the American forces in the Revolution, and then the first president. In 1789, he got out of hot, sticky New York City and took a tour of the New England states to show himself to the people. He did not go to Rhode Island because Rhode Island was not yet part of the United States. You know, the whole 13 colonies that become the United States, the last one to ratify the Constitution was Rhode Island. They didn't want to play. And finally, the other states said, look, you want to do business with us? You want trade barriers? Really? I know this is a little familiar to current political thing. I won't go beyond that. But nonetheless, they kind of forced Rhode Island to go along and ratify the Constitution. So it took another summer for Washington to make his way to Rhode Island, because in 1789 it wasn't part of his country. He wasn't president in Rhode Island. So he didn't go there in 1789 with his tour through Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Vermont wasn't a state yet. Vermont's our 14th state, but enough of that. So anyway, Moses the Exodus was the lay leader of the Newport community and addressed Washington. I'll let you read his words. I hate it when people read off slides, but you want me to. No, you're good, you can read, wonderful. If you can't see it, well, maybe I should, just in case you can't see it from the back row. Yeah, sexist, these people, you know, I still get paid by the word. I've just taken a soundbite out of it. Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great. Washington basically echoed back the words that Sextus gave him when he visited, along with Thomas Jefferson and New York Governor George Clinton, the Supreme Court Justice John Blair, and the Congressman William Lawton Smith. And Washington replied, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more than toleration spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should remain themselves as good citizens in giving in on all occasions their effectual support. If only government was ideal, as Washington worded it. Sorry for the editorial there, I'll stop. Anyway, moving on to other early American Jews of note. Moses Michael Hayes, 1739 to 1805, was born in New York City, and in 1764 inherited his father's shipping business. In 1769, he and his wife Rachel moved to Newport and was imprisoned for debt, but rebuilt his business. In early America, actually right into the 1830s, 40s, it was not uncommon for people who had a debt judgment against them to be imprisoned. It wasn't a crime to be in debt, but if the person you owed money to and you couldn't pay them, wanted to, they could coerce you into paying them or keep you from skipping town by having you imprisoned. So that's the whole idea of debtor's prison. It was the county jail. It wasn't here in America, it wasn't a special place. Sometimes it'd be a different room in the county jail than they put people awaiting trial in, but nonetheless, that's what the whole imprisonment for debt thing was. Anyway, but in 1776, being a patriot and a supporter of the American cause for liberty, he moved to Boston when the British invaded Newport, and took in his widowed sister, Rita Turreau, and her children. As remember by now, Isaac Turreau has died in the Caribbean, and he's left his widow and family. And so he's the founder and the first depositor of Massachusetts Bank in 1784. The first bank in the Americas anywhere was not until 1780 when a bank was established in Pennsylvania. The Bank of North America it was called. And so the first bank in New England was the Bank of Massachusetts, and Hayes was the first depositor as well as one of the principal founders of that bank. And he was elected the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge. He was the only Jew allowed in the lodge, but he had such social and economic prominence that he was elected Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge. I'm sorry?
Let it slide?
Yes. And philanthropist, he gave to a lot of causes, including Harvard College, which of course was founded to train Puritan ministers, but by the time he's giving it to it, the Puritans, much to their chagrin, had seen the Harvard faculty go Unitarian, but we didn't need to get into all that. Anyway, in Philadelphia, since we've been spending a lot of time in New York and New England, let's head a little bit south. Jewish traders arrived in that area in the 1650s, and of course it was officially founded as a community. Philadelphia was by William Penn in 1685. The first Jewish resident seems to have been Jonas Aaron in 1703. Nathan Levy, excuse my tongue. Nathan Levy tried to buy land for a cemetery and he was finally able to in 1740. The congregation Miksa Israel, a Sephardic Orthodox congregation, was chartered by 1773 after years of informal worship in various homes of the members of the congregation. And by 1775, 300 of Philadelphia's 35,000 residents were Jews. Philadelphia at that time was the biggest city in North America. It's kind of ludicrous now to think 35,000 is the biggest city, but it wasn't a highly urbanized society yet. But again, so many of these early Jewish settlers being merchants, you'll notice that the stories are very often in seaports, the hubs of trade, since water transportation was the only really economical way of moving goods or even people around. Chaim Solomon, another a Philadelphia Jew, immigrated immigrated to New York from Poland in 1772. You'll notice that in the bicentennial back in 1976, he got a U.S. postage stamp. It's amazing that 50 years ago postage was a dime, you know? Some of you can't remember that, but anyway. And so, yeah, he got a U.S. postage stamp for himself. He was a money broker and a translator, and whether or not he was a spy, he was certainly accused of espionage by the British. He escaped a death sentence in New York City in 1778, actually, and got out of town and headed to Philadelphia rather than have the British hang him. So luckily he escaped. When he got to Philadelphia and got back on his feet, he loaned or raised $650,000, a huge sum at the time. There is no magic multiplier, I could say that's so many $1 billion today, because translating money value is more complicated than just having some magic multiplier, but this is not an economics lesson, so I'll spare you that. But anyway, he was instrumental with his international and monetary connections and the fact that he spoke several languages in brokering French and Dutch loans. If it weren't for foreign loans, the United States never would have been able to finance enough of the war to achieve independence. So that was a real critical contribution that Chaim Solomon made. And unfortunately, he died penniless of tuberculosis in 1785 when he was only 44 years old. He probably contracted the tuberculosis when he was imprisoned in New York City on a prison hold. What the British did to imprison people was they find old, leaky, smelly, rat-infested sailing ships that were never going to cross the Atlantic again, and figuring most people couldn't swim, and it was easy to hold people captive on these rotting ships, which of course were also centers of spreading disease and were not very pleasant places to be interred. The Americans did similar things like that. The British prisoners and later convicts were held in Connecticut in a copper mine. What they did is they shoved them in this 70-foot hole, deep hole in the ground, pulled up the ladder and said, good luck trying to escape. So, yeah, prisons were not very pleasant places. I'm sure they're not now. I hope I never find out. Anyway, Jonas Phillips, an Ashkenazi Jew from Germany, migrated to Charleston, South Carolina in 1756 as one of those indentured servants. In other words, someone who agrees to work for somebody else for a limited period of time to pay for his passage and his upkeep while he is coming to and first in the Americas. He moved to Albany, New York after his indenture was up in 1759, and then moved down the Hudson to New York City and married a Sephardic Jew, Rebecca Mendez Mercado. They had 21 children. God bless them. God bless them. There's yeah. Talk about the mother of our country, huh? Anyway, in 1776, when the British invaded New York City, he left for Philadelphia and he joined the Continental Army, and he became a leader and the president of the Mikveh Israel.
What happened to his wife?
They're all dead now, as I like to say. I don't know. I imagine when her time came, she was quite tired. God bless her. Anyway, Dr. John de Seguera, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Portuguese version of his name, but there it is, 1712 to 1795. He was born in Lisbon, Portugal, and his family moved when he was a boy to London, England, and he studied medicine at the University of Leiden, back in the Netherlands, and in 1745 he moved to Williamsburg, Virginia, which was the largest or the most prestigious colonial capital in British North America at the time. And in 1769, he treated George Washington's stepdaughter, Patsy, who suffered from epilepsy. 1774, he became director of the insane asylum in Williamsburg. That Colonial Williamsburg has partially turned into part of their museum right now. And Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, credited him, I don't know if he really did or not, but he believed Jefferson. Jefferson believed that de Seguera is the person who introduced the tomato to America. So, for everybody who had tomato on their salad tonight, round of applause for Dr. Seguera. Yay. Unless you don't like tomatoes, you can. But Charleston, South Carolina, was another settlement of American Jews, mostly, like in a lot of the early settlements, mostly Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. 1733, the Spanish invaded Georgia, and because, again, the fear of the Spanish Inquisition, a lot of the Jewish settlers in Georgia decided to leave Georgia and go to Charleston. So it wasn't that far away. Savannah is usually where they had settled, which is right on the South Carolina border on the Savannah River. Anyway, 1749, Kalal Kodesh Beth Elohim congregation was established there in Charleston. And in 1774, Francis Salvador, the first Jew elected to public office, the Provincial Congress, was also, as we read earlier from one of the cards, was the first Jew killed in the American Revolution. Sad to say, of happy memory. So by 1800, Charleston had over 2,000 Jewish residents, and that was more at that time than any other American city. So Francis Salvador immigrated from London to Charleston, South Carolina, and he was an active participant in the South Carolina General Assembly at the tender age of 27, and he helped to draft the state's constitution after independence, advocated for independence and for the good treatment of soldiers in terms of health and especially when they're wounded. And he warned of Native American attacks during the American Revolutionary War. The indigenous people were kind of torn about when a war is going on, okay, who do we side with? Let's try to pretend to be neutral, but nobody likes people that are neutral. It's like pick a side, pick our side is what most people got, including the indigenous people and pacifists like the Quakers. But in 1776, as I said, he was the first Jew to die in the Revolution when he was ambushed and sustained gunshot wounds, and he was scalped by the indigenous people allied with the British. As I mentioned, Savannah, Georgia, as we were working down the eastern seaboard here, this is as far as south as we're going to get. Savannah, Georgia had 42 Jewish settlers, 8 Ashkenazi, and 34 Sephardic Jews in the initial settlement. By 1735, Congregation Mikveh Israel was founded, but a schism developed in that group. And in 1742, the War of Jenkins' Ear. In the early 1800s, England was always fighting these little trade wars with somebody. And in one of them, an English merchant who was attacked by the Spanish supposedly had his ear cut off. And the story goes that somehow the ear survived. And somebody brought it along with his bloody shirt to Parliament and waved it around and said, "We got to declare war on these people. Look what they've done to one of our merchants." Anyway, that's why it's called the War of Jenkins' Ear. As I mentioned before, Spanish troops threatened to invade Georgia. They didn't really invade Georgia, but just the threat of it forced a lot of the Sephardim in fleeing to Charleston to avoid the Spanish Inquisition. And so they didn't get a synagogue built in Savannah until 1820, many years after American independence. There's a nice turn of the 20th century postcard of the Temple Mikveh Israel in Savannah from 1878. If you've never been to Savannah, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful old city, lots of Spanish moss dripping from the trees, lots of squares. And 27 little parks, sometimes very large parks, sometimes fairly small parks called squares. They have a wonderful jump on, jump off tour bus like Boston has, the Boston. One time, has nothing to do with this topic, I'll tell you, when I was in Savannah years ago, and I was on one of these hop on, hop off tour buses, and the bus driver, like in Boston, has kind of a conversation, has a spiel they give you, and they also ask questions of the people on the bus, sometimes trivia. And we're going by one, and she says, "This is Warren Square. Does anybody know who Joseph Warren was? I live in Warren, Massachusetts. It's named after the guy." I raised my hand, and she said, "Really? Nobody ever knows?" I said, "Yeah, he's a patriot of the American Revolution. He died at the Battle of Bunker Hill." I could have also gone on that he was the first case of dental forensics. A year after the battle, they dug up the body. They didn't know if it was him. He'd been mangled and, of course, dead for a year. And they wanted to bury him properly, being one of the early leaders of the revolution. And so they called his best friend, well, one of his good friends, Paul Revere, over to see if he could tell if that was his body. I don't think I could recognize. But Revere had learned dentistry, cosmetic dentistry. And he made some dentures for, just a partial, for a couple years before he was died, for Joseph Warren. So Revere opened the mouth of the corpse, and there was the dental bridge he made for his buddy. He said, "Yep, that's him." Honest true story. Nothing to do with Savannah, though. Never mind. But anyhow, I digress. Mordecai Sheftel, 1735 to 1797, became the Commissary General of Georgia and later rose to the rank of Colonel, the highest ranking Jew in the Continental Army. Sheftel was captured during the First Battle of Savannah in 1778, yet continued, even from prison, to arrange funding for the Americans. Talk about a dedicated patriot. He was exchanged in 1780. Throughout the American Revolution, actually throughout most 18th century wars, people really didn't want to hold prisoners of war very long. It's expensive, it's cumbersome, it's not pretty. So they just basically would say, okay, kind of like we're doing in Israel and Gaza now. You exchange prisoners, and you try to get them to promise not to fight anymore. But anyway, in the first federal census, you know how every 10 years the government wants to know more and more about you, mostly so they can equitably distribute federal votes in Congress and taxes, and now they want to know all sorts of things about us. But in 1790, the first census, there were 246 Jews in New York City, 350 in New York State. They didn't ask what your faith was in these censuses. But it's historians looking at names and not seeing fairly obviously Sephardic or Ashkenazi names among all these people named Hezekiah Smith and then Ezekiel Johnson have identified that many people as probably Jewish. 188 in Charleston, 300 in all of South Carolina, 122 in Philadelphia, 250 in all of Pennsylvania, 76 in Newport, and throughout the rest of New England, 150. 28 in Richmond, Virginia, 200 in all of Virginia, and 15 in Savannah, 100 in Georgia. So about 1/10% of the U.S. population were Jewish, and at that time, mostly were Sephardic Jews. The big influx of Ashkenazi, these are the two other much bigger influxes of Jewish Americans between 1820 and 1880. The Jewish population ballooned from 3,000 people to about 250,000 people, mostly from Germany and Central Europe. And then between 1880 and 1924, when they changed a lot of immigration laws in the United States, over 2 million Jews from Russia, Austria-Hungarian Empire, and Romania came to America. I love this picture of the colonial man with a shofar. I don't know if you like it or not, but my best friend was a cornet player in high school, and he still, at 66 years old, takes great pride in blowing the shofar for as long as humanly possible every year in his congregation. And he always sends me a video of it. His face is beet red, but anyway, he still has the lungs. Anyway, that's all my pictures. If anybody has questions, I might not be able to answer them, or if you want to share things you know that I didn't talk about, that would be nice too. Oh, well, the show's over. Pardon me?
You said something about the largest city. Where did New York fit in then?
Well, New York had a few hundred Jews. It was probably third at the time. Pardon me? Philadelphia. So Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, Philadelphia. Wait, yeah, I think that's right. Anyway, yes.
The Spanish Inquisition go on.
The Spanish Inquisition kind of faded. It kind of ended when the Spanish monarchy under the Habsburgs ended. When during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte, the dictator of France, ejected the monarchs of both Spain and Portugal and put his brothers on the thrones. He put his brother on the throne of the Netherlands as well. So if you were Napoleon's brother for a while, you got to be king of something. But anyway, yeah, it kind of all fell apart. A lot of old Europe fell apart during the Napoleonic Wars. Germany, before Napoleon, had been 360 some odd different political entities, cities, kingdoms, princedoms, dukedoms, electorates, margravites, on and on and on. But Napoleon reorganized it into just a few dozen. And then, of course, during the later 19th century, Germany unified under the Prussian royal family with the Prussian royal family's Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. It went on for hundreds of years, yeah. It went on for hundreds of years. Yes? Oh, we'll take your time and then, okay.
Oh, good for you. Is there any documentation of Inquisition in North America?
No, not that I know of.
So even if they took over an area, it wasn't like they looked for the Jews?
Well, again, Spain didn't have, Spanish colonialism was very different than British colonialism. Spanish and French colonialism tended to be a lot less settler driven and a lot more light hand spread out than Anglo colonialism. In other words, you tend to have, yes, I'm in charge, but you don't have very much backing you up in both the Spanish and the French settlements. I wouldn't even call them settlements, proto-settlements maybe, in what became the United States. So you don't really have a powerful Spanish control. It was more fear of that. It was fear of it, and I would imagine justifiable fear. I would be afraid. But anyway, so no, I found no documentation of the actual use of the Inquisition in what's now the United States. Yes, sir?
Yeah, this may be beyond the scope of what I'm talking about, but do you have any idea of when and why you started moving to the East Coast, say the Midwest, even farther than that?
Sure. Jews tend to follow the rest of European American settlers as the Europeans tend to have more children, not always 21 to a couple, but tend to have more children than they can divide their farms to have them self-supporting. And so the history of the United States is basically taking the land away from the indigenous people and saying it's ours now and settling it and putting our people on it. And so as economic opportunity developed going west, Jewish Americans went with the rest of the American population So,
Two more
yeah.
questions.
Yes.
Two more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions. Yes.
This is a statement I just want to say, if anybody, whether Venezuela or not, every summer, they read the Washington letter, and the letter to Washington by Moses Statius. And it's either in Truro or this year was the old Colonial House and Capitol building next to it. And it's quite interesting and fun to see.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, one more question, statement, complaint? Sure. No, he doesn't have a complaint. God bless him. Okay, wonderful. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Enjoy your dessert.
I want to personally thank Tom and Dave for the videography, and Tom for that wonderful education we just got. I thought New York City was bigger.
It is now.
It is. Yeah. It's dessert time, and then we're